In the high-stakes boardroom of 2007, the air is thick with a confidence that borders on terminal arrogance. At the head of the table sits a middle-aged Finnish executive, an embodiment of Nokia's undisputed reign, wearing a charcoal gray wool suit, a light blue shirt with a crisp spread collar, and silver-rimmed glasses. He holds the Nokia N95, a masterpiece of tactile engineering, feeling the satisfying click of the dual slider mechanism. To him, and to the thousands of engineers in Espoo, this device represents the pinnacle of human communication. They are not just market leaders, they are the market. With a 40% global share, Nokia is the sun around which the entire mobile universe orbits. The executive looks out the window at the sprawling, snowy Finnish landscape, convinced that the cold, hard logic of hardware supremacy is unassailable. He believes that people want buttons they can feel and batteries that last for days, dismissing the whispers from Silicon Valley as the mere distractions of computer geeks playing in a radio man's world. This is the moment of peak insulation, where the echoes of past success are so loud they drown out the sound of the approaching tidal wave that is about to erase a $250 billion empire. Suddenly, the frame shifts from the quiet Finnish boardroom to the blinding stage lights of the Macworld Expo in San Francisco. The executive watches the grainy live stream on a desktop monitor, his expression transitioning from curiosity to a subtle, defensive smirk. On the screen, a man in a black turtleneck reveals a device that lacks a physical keyboard, a concept the Finnish giant had already prototyped and discarded as a toy. The executive adjusts his silver-rimmed glasses, leaning closer to the screen as Steve Jobs demonstrates multi-touch scrolling. In this precise moment, the DNA of the mobile industry is being rewritten, but the man in the charcoal suit sees only a fragile glass screen with no 3G connectivity and a weak camera. He fails to realize that the product isn't the phone itself, but the software ecosystem it carries. He turns back to his team, reaffirming that Nokia quality will always prevail over Apple hype. This is the fatal friction of the ego trap, the inability to see that the rules of the game have changed from how well you build a device to how well you build a platform. The $250 billion valuation begins its silent, invisible bleed, starting right here in this room of believers. To understand the fall, we must understand the climb, a journey from a riverside paper mill to a global titan. The executive stands before a vintage display wall in the Nokia headquarters, tracing the history of a company that once made rubber boots and cables. He stands tall, still in his charcoal gray suit, his posture reflecting the pride of a nation. For decades, Nokia was the master of pivoting. They were agile, lean, and daring. They had survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, their primary market, by betting everything on the GSM standard. By the late 1990s, the Nokia 3310 was becoming a cultural icon, a device so durable it was practically legendary. The executive remembers the energy of those years, the feeling that Finnish engineering was the gold standard of the world. They had built a supply chain so efficient it was studied at Harvard. They weren't just selling phones. They were selling the very concept of connecting people. The brand was synonymous with reliability, and the executive feels that heritage in the walls around him. This history of successful pivots created a dangerous illusion, the belief that they had already faced their greatest challenges and emerged invincible, making them blind to a threat that didn't come from a hardware competitor, but from a computer company. By 2004, Nokia's dominance was so absolute that it became its own worst enemy. The executive sits in a modern minimalist office, surrounded by stacks of market research reports that all point to one conclusion: stay the course. Success had bred a massive, bloated bureaucracy. Within the company, internal fiefdoms had developed. The hardware teams fought the software teams, and different phone divisions competed against each other for resources rather than focusing on the external market. The executive looks at a complex organizational chart on his mahogany desk, a labyrinth of committees and subcommittees. Every decision, even the color of a button, had to pass through months of internal vetting. This was the era of the Symbian operating system, a fragmented, clunky piece of code that was never intended for the internet age, but Nokia was too invested in it to quit. They were trapped by their own scale, a giant oil tanker that saw the iceberg, but simply couldn't turn fast enough because too many people were arguing in the steering room. The culture had shifted from how do we innovate to how do we protect our share. And the executive, despite his brilliance, was a product of this rigid system. The data tells a story of a collapse that was both rapid and excruciatingly preventable. As our executive stands in a high-tech data visualization room, glowing red graphs projected on the walls show the terrifying death cross. In 2007, Nokia's operating profit was a staggering $11 billion. But by 2011, it had swung to a massive loss. The numbers are brutal. Nokia's share price plummeted from over $40 in late 2007 to under $2 by 2012. They were losing 1% of market share every single month to the iPhone and the rising tide of Android. The executive watches a map of the world where Nokia's blue dominance is being rapidly eaten away by red and green dots. He realizes that their R&D spend was actually $5 billion a year, more than Apple and Google combined. Yet they produced almost nothing that could compete with the App Store. They were spending more to achieve less because their investment was scattered across dozens of different operating system versions. This wasn't a lack of money. It was a lack of vision. They had 10 different versions of Symbian that didn't talk to each other, creating a developer's nightmare that effectively handed the future to their rivals on a silver platter. The core of the failure was a psychological phenomenon known as competence trap. The executive is now in a laboratory setting, looking at the disassembled components of a high-end Nokia device compared to an iPhone. He sees the beautiful, rugged hardware Nokia was famous for, the high-quality Carl Zeiss lens, the durable casing, and then he looks at the iPhone's internals, which seem almost simple by comparison. But the reality was that Nokia's competence was in mechanical engineering, while the world had moved to software-led design. Between 2008 and 2010, Apple's developer community grew by over 1,000%, while Nokia's remained stagnant. Nokia had actually invented a tablet with a touchscreen and internet connectivity 3 years before the iPad, but the leadership killed it because they feared it would cannibalize their phone sales. This fear of cannibalization is the silent killer of giants. They had the technology, the patents, and the brilliant minds, but the ego of the middle management and the rigid Nokia way meant that anything that didn't fit the existing business model was treated as a threat rather than an opportunity. They were polishing the brass on the Titanic while the hull was already breached. Then came the infamous burning platform memo. In 2011, the new CEO, Stephen Elop, sent an internal message that compared Nokia to a man standing on a burning oil rig in the North Sea. The executive is back in the darkened boardroom, reading this memo on a tablet, the glow illuminating his grim face. The memo was a desperate attempt to shock the company out of its lethargy. It admitted that while Nokia had been fighting with swords, hardware, its competitors had been building ecosystems, platforms. The decision was made to abandon Symbian and bet everything on Microsoft's Windows Phone. It was a move of absolute desperation. Within days of the announcement, Nokia's market value dropped by another $15 billion. They had effectively told their customers that their current products were dead men walking before the new ones were even ready. The transition was a disaster. By the time the first Windows-powered Lumias hit the market, Android and iOS had already captured 90% of the developer mindshare. Nokia wasn't just late to the party. They arrived after the music had stopped and the lights were being turned off. The end of the mobile era for Nokia came not with a bang, but with a signature. In September 2013, Nokia announced it was selling its entire handset business to Microsoft for $7.2 billion, a fraction of its former value. The executive stands in a sterile, modern hallway of the Nokia headquarters, watching as workers begin to remove the iconic Nokia logo from the building's exterior. It is a moment of profound national grief for Finland. At the press conference, the then CEO famously said, "We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost." This statement perfectly encapsulated the tragedy. Doing everything by the book in a world where the book is being rewritten is, in itself, a fatal error. But in the shadows of this defeat, a new strategy was forming. Nokia was no longer a phone company, but it still owned one of the most powerful patent portfolios and mapping services in the world. The executive adjusts his jacket, his expression shifting from defeat to a hard-earned, quiet resilience. The ego had been humbled, and in that humility, the seeds of a different kind of survival were being planted. Nokia's rebirth was built on the invisible backbone of the modern world, infrastructure. The executive is now in a high-tech control center, surrounded by monitors showing 5G network grids spanning the globe. After shedding the phone business, Nokia pivoted to telecommunications hardware and software, acquiring Alcatel-Lucent and becoming a world leader in 5G technology. Today, they are one of the few companies capable of building the massive networks that power our digital lives. They traded the consumer's pocket for the world's towers. The executive looks at the screen, seeing the Nokia logo once again. But this time, it represents a multi-billion-dollar business that is vital to global security and connectivity. They learn that survival isn't about holding on to a product. It's about leveraging your core strengths in a new context. Nokia didn't die. It evolved. It moved from being a visible icon to an invisible necessity. The $250 billion ego was gone, replaced by a disciplined, infrastructure-focused powerhouse that understands that in business, the only constant is change. The story of Nokia is the ultimate cautionary tale for any leader in the 21st century. It teaches us that your greatest success is often the very thing that prevents your next one. The executive walks out of the Nokia headquarters and into the crisp Finnish air, the same charcoal suit and silver-rimmed glasses as the beginning, but his demeanor is humbler, wiser. He stops at the edge of a frozen lake, looking out at the horizon. The lesson is clear. Innovation is not about having the best technology, it's about having the most adaptable culture. If you are not willing to cannibalize your own products, someone else will do it for you. Complacency is a slow-acting poison, and ego is the blindfold that prevents you from seeing the cure. As the sun sets over the Finnish landscape, casting a golden hue on the snow, we see a man who has witnessed the rise, fall, and transformation of a giant. Nokia's journey from a $250 billion peak to near extinction and back to stability is a reminder that in the world of business, you are either changing or you are dying. There is no middle ground. The next time you hold a device in your hand, remember, the brand on the back matters far less than the vision behind the screen.